So watch us anytime on the New Haven Independence YouTube page or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. I'm Kevin Watsey, host of Liquid Lunch. I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Regional Water Authority, and I am a water nerd, and today's show is all about water, so I could not be happier. We're going to call today Water Quality Wednesday. How about that? Because the topic of today's show is going to be water quality. This week, the Regional Water Authority is mailing out postcards to every one of our customers, directing them to the newly published Water Quality Report, the annual Water Quality Report. It's on our website. The postcard is going to let them know it's available and tell them where to find it. On today's show, I invited back my good friend and water quality manager at the RWA, Tom Barger, to help us understand what's in the report. Why do we do the report? What it tells us about our water quality, and what it doesn't tell us, quite honestly. Tom, this is your third time on the show. Welcome. The past two times we've had you tell different versions of your story and how you got to where you are, so we won't go through your whole story, but for those who may have not heard your first two appearances, can you give us like a Cliff's Note version of your story?
Sure, Kevin. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me back. I do appreciate it. Always good to be here with you. I've been with the Water Authority, Kevin, now about 40 years, and I've been doing water quality for about the last 35 or so. So, found my way here after graduate school at the University of New Haven, where I majored in environmental science and engineering. So, my education prior to UNH was in biology and chemistry. Got an opportunity to work at the Water Authority starting in 1985. Collected samples for a handful of months, and then moved over to source protection, where I spent the next 5 years. Another opportunity in water quality opened up at that point around 1990, and I've been there ever since. So really enjoying everything I do. I've seen the industry grow over 35 years, and while I won't say it's not recognizable to me, it has changed considerably over those 35 years, but it's been quite a trip.
Yeah, but the regulations have changed a lot over 35 years, I'm sure. And I will point out, as I did last time, the RWA and our customers are very lucky to have Tom, because he is a nationally recognized water quality expert. He serves on the National Board of Directors for the American Water Works Association, which is kind of the industry association that sets standards for water utilities. Everything water, water quality, water utility operation. They are the group that utilities look to for the standards and how to improve. And Tom is on the national board for the AWWA. So again, thanks for coming. As I mentioned, our customers this week are going to be getting a postcard directing them to the newest water quality report. In years past, we actually mailed out the entire water quality report, and I will show you, if you're watching on the YouTube, this is what our water quality report looks like. We're not mailing the whole report this year. We're mailing a postcard. That's the industry standard now, is to send a postcard. Saves our customers money and saves the environment a lot of printing, because the report is 16 pages times about 125,000 customers. That's a lot of paper. So we're saving a lot of paper. Customers can now go on our website to view the report anytime they want. So let's talk about the annual water quality report. It's also known as the Consumer Confidence Report. That's what our government calls it. We're required to produce a consumer confidence report every year. And Tom, what is it? What is a consumer confidence report /water quality report?
Yeah, sure, Kevin. Thanks. And again, just a quick shout out to you and your staff. I know that you did a lot of work on the CCR, the Consumer Confidence Report, aka the Water Quality Report, and reformatting it and presenting it differently. Kudos to you. I think it reads better. I think it's more comprehensive, and I think our customers will get more from it as a result. But to answer your question, essentially, I refer to this as an exceptions report, Kevin. I mean, certainly it is required of us by regulation. We have to publish this. But really, it's not the sum total of everything we do. We do a lot of water quality analysis. We, in fact, do more than we're required to do by regulation. We think that's just a good idea. But this report is really just summarizing, for all those things that we do have to analyze for, this is what we're finding. So anything that we test for and don't find, you won't find in this report.
Unless it's required that we put it in there anyway.
Exactly. Correct? So, right, there's kind of a a subset to the regulatory required tests. There's some unregulated parameters that we're obligated also to put in here. PFAS would be an example. PFAS is not going to be regulated until 2029. However, we're putting that in the report. We have to put that in the report, but it's something we've been publishing, for our customers right along. I mean, there's no secrets. There's nothing hiding behind the curtain. It is what it is. We're happy to share that. So we're also obligated in here, for instance, we look at radon from time to time. Again, not regulated. We do test for it every 3 to 5 years, making sure our database on our baseline remains accurate. And we publish and share that data in the CCR as well.
And so we actually test for dozens of contaminants that we're required to test for. But unless the government tells us it has to go in this report, or unless we actually have a violation, you're not going to see it in this. You're not going to see those dozens and dozens of contaminants in this report.
That's correct. And the other thing too, and this throws people off a little bit, but I understand why. A lot of those parameters, water quality parameters that consumers are interested in, I'll use things like calcium as an example. So if you're an individual that brews beer, right? So you're brewing beer in your garage, your basement, or you're one of our micro breweries here in the area, you may be very interested in calcium concentration. Calcium concentrations aren't regulated federally or within the state of Connecticut, so you're not going to see things like those salts that you may be interested in because you're a hobbyist, or you have in this case, a brewery in my example. You're not going to find that in the CCR, the Water Quality Report, simply because it's an unregulated parameter. You can certainly contact the Water Authority. We'd be happy to let you know what those numbers are. We do have those. It's important for us to monitor that for a variety of reasons, but not everything is going to be in this report for a number of circumstances.
And calcium is like hard water, right?
Exactly. It's the primary constituent of water.
Yeah, and it's I guess it's more of an aesthetic problem. Right?
Yeah, unless you're buying a new dishwasher, and then the owner's manual wants to know what your hardness values are so that you can dose it appropriately with detergent. So that's not an uncommon call for us to receive.
Yeah. So thank you for that. So if you don't mind, Tom, I would love to not go page by page through this because not every, I don't know that we have the time to go page to page. But to hit certain highlights in the report, I'd love for you to just kind of explain what we're reading in there. Because the report, my group writes the report along with your group and our certified lab. We try and make it as understandable as possible. There's certain language we have to use that the government requires us to use. And there's certain things we have to have in there. But I thought it'd be really helpful. Go through the report, pick out some things to kind of explain them in more layman's terms. So if you don't mind, I'm actually going to start on the inside front cover, believe it or not. We're not even fully into the report, where you will see a map. And we get this question every once in a while, so pardon me. So I figured I'd just ask you. The map it's two colors. It's green and it's blue. And it shows a map of the greater New Haven region. And it shows consumers served by the RWA, and then the blue section is consumers not served by the RWA but included in the district. Can you tell us what that means? Why would you not be served by us but still be in our district?
Yeah, the way that water utilities are kind of, I'll say, broken down, if you will, within the state of Connecticut is you have service territories that are assigned. So the Regional Water Authority has a geographic area that we are responsible for, even including towns where there is no public water supply. But if there were to be a public water supply, we may or may not be involved, in the provision of water. So what we'll have here is what we refer to as Kevin, water towns and land towns. So water towns are those that are depicted in green, where we actually have water distributed to consumers, right? We have pipes in the street, et cetera, so we're providing water service to those towns. Towns that are in blue, while we don't provide water, they are providing water to us. In other words, those are where some of the resources are located. So if you go into, say, Killingworth or Madison or Guilford, those are areas that are served public water by the Connecticut Water Company, but the Regional Water Authority has resources where some of the reservoirs that we're utilizing for, say, City of New Haven's water supply are physically located. So those towns are represented in our district. Representatives of those towns do have voting rights on our boards, and the voting rights are weighted. We don't need to get into that calculation, but there's certainly representation of all of these towns within the Regional Water Authorities district.
And I will say, if you want to see how those votes are weighted, you could turn to the inside back cover of your water quality report, where we actually list our towns and the weighted votes on our representative policy board. I didn't even have that in my notes to talk about, but you hit it anyway. So when we turn to page 1, simple headline: what's in this report? We talk about where the water comes from, our water, the water that we serve our customers, and what we do to make the water safe. So can you just kind of summarize, where do we get our water from?
Yeah, it's a combination of both groundwater and surface water supplies, Kevin. So when we look at surface water supplies, about 88% of the water that we're distributing on any given day originates in one of our 4 surface water systems.
Surface water is like a reservoir, a lake, a river, any water that you can actually see with your eyes.
Yeah. So for us specifically, we operate strictly from reservoir systems. So we have Lake Gillard, Lake Saltonstall, Lake Whitney in our West River system, out in the Bethany and Woodbridge area. And then the other remaining 12% of water is derived from 7 independent well fields in Hampden, Cheshire, Derby, and Sony.
And that's what us water geeks call groundwater. Water that's in the ground that you got to put a big straw in and suck it out.
Yeah, and it's not that much different from an individual homeowner that may have their own private well. It's just on a different scale. It's producing millions of gallons of water a day as opposed to, tens or hundreds of gallons of water a day in a residential situation. But regardless of where that water originates, we play by the same rule book. So all the water, regardless of where it starts, must meet the same set of water quality standards.
So we have quite an extensive water supply system throughout the area. It's all very interconnected, where we have the ability to move water around to where it's needed.
Yeah, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, a little bit more.
Yes.
It's a very interconnected water distribution system. So the 11 points of treatment that we own, operate, all essentially plug in, if you will, to, and not to use an electrical term, but they're all connected to a common water distribution system. So there's a lot of commingling of water chemistry in there, which, has certainly a lot of positives associated with it, but has some challenges from the perspective in how we share that data, right? So a lot of the water chemistry, if we're coming out of a resource with a value of X, once it gets into water distribution, it commingles with its peers, if you will, and now has a chemistry of Y. And sometimes it's difficult to share that information specifically because that degree of blending is highly variable from day to day, week to week, or season to season.
Yeah, I would say especially season to season, right? Because as we're right now, we're recording this show in May. We're ramping up for the summer, and which means usage is going to go up, which means that split of where the water comes from could change dramatically based on the demands of that day, week.
Exactly right. We'll make some distribution system related decisions based on demand, and water, that used to go left now may go right, kind of thing. So
yeah, so it's and we have a team of professionals back at Sargent Drive that can look at maps and tell you exactly where that water's going, left or right, how much is going that way. And I think now's a good time to add that, Tom, you have a staff that is out there in the system doing every day taking samples, right?
That's correct. Yeah, 5 days a week we collect samples, represent our water distribution system. We don't bundle. So for instance, town of Cheshire, that doesn't mean I go to Cheshire on Monday and I never see Cheshire again for the rest of the week. We have everything split up over those 5 days. So we're visiting just about every town, just about every day, because we want to make sure that the samples that we're collecting are representative of what our consumers are receiving.
Let me ask, I meant to ask you earlier, so this report that we're talking about is the 2024 annual water quality report. We're almost halfway through 2025. Why is the 2024 report just coming out now?
Yeah, the way that's set up, Kevin, is a little not peculiar, but suspect, right? I mean, I think your point and your question is valid. We have a full data set from 2024. So that's the data that we're publishing right now.
So this is a January to December report.
Exactly right. So now we're certainly collecting samples here in 2025, but if we put out that data right now, it's segmented, right? We can maybe give you first quarter 2025 data. I think to address that point, we're going to be seeing some adjustments to the CCR requirements at the federal level, where right now we're publishing once a year data from the previous calendar year, as you just pointed out. That cadence is going to change. We're going to be publishing data twice a year to try to account for that gap period, if you will. So instead of now having to publish, we'll say around June 1st of each year for the previous calendar year, we'll be looking at probably an April release and probably a December release. So we'll be looking at that data 2 times a year to try to address that data gap that you brought up.
So yeah,
that starts 2027.
2027, yes, I have that circled on my calendar. And in 2024, it's interesting to point out. So we have this full data set from the 12 months. The RWA took 8,100 samples. So Tom's staff took 8,100 samples during the calendar year and conducted over 66,000 tests of those 8,100 samples. Can you talk about like the difference in those numbers? You only don't say only 8,100's a lot, but you did 66,000 tests on 8,100 samples. Can you talk about that a little?
Sure. I mean, the samples, we essentially start testing the water, upon rainfall. So we'll collect samples from feeder streams. We'll take samples from monitoring wells that represent the groundwater that we take water from our production wells. We'll test water, in situ from those individual reservoirs to make decisions around where the best water quality is to bring into the treatment plants. We'll test numerous places within the water treatment process itself inside those facilities. We'll monitor distribution system water quality from the water mains, the storage tanks, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're looking at 8,100 tests, they really run the gamut from rainfall through consumers' taps. And from those samples, we're testing microbiology, a variety of different chemistries. So we're looking at multiple tests per sample, and I think that's largely where you get that distinction between 8,100 and 66,000. I think you said something in that neighborhood.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So that's I think the reason why you see a lot more tests based on the number of samples, because we're evaluating any number of things from those different samples.
Right. Yeah, you could take 1 liter of water, so that's 1 sample, but you could do 150 tests on that 1 liter,
sure,
depending on what you want. And what's cool too is when we give kids tours of our treatment plants, they'll often look and they'll see like a sink with 5 or 6 faucets just continually running, and they always ask what's going on. And I always love to point out that that's water from every step in the treatment process. Right. So we can actually test to make sure that the treatment in that step is doing what it's supposed to do.
And that's exactly what the operators do. They'll use those continually running faucets to assess what that chemistry primarily is at that stage. So when they are making adjustments, they can then go and QC that adjustment and make sure it's doing what the intended adjustment was. So.
And so the next section I want to touch on briefly is called Sources of Contaminants. Mm-hmm. That's on page 3. Can you just briefly talk about some of the main sources of contaminants in not just our water system, but in any water system? I mean, it's pretty universal, the sources of contaminants.
Yeah, I think, many of them are fairly straightforward. It could be, materials running off the streets right after a rainfall. It could be, things that are put into a residential septic system that's not properly maintained and overflows. Or could be any number of synthetic products that are out there and enter the environment in any multitude of different ways. There can also be naturally occurring contaminants, right? Mother Nature's not always a a beneficial steward, if you will, right? So I mean, we have to be concerned about things like arsenic and mercury and other contaminants that are found on the periodic table of the elements, right? They're part of the geology of the planet. They're reflected in the water chemistry in certain areas from time to time. And it's something that we do keep a close eye on. We monitor for all of those types of things. So sometimes you'll have contaminants that are synthetic as a result of just our everyday lives, and you'll have other things that Mother Nature is kind of throwing us to make sure we're paying attention.
And it's so important to know ahead of time, because that's how our treatment operators know how to treat the water. And I guess it's pretty regional too. There's probably some parts of the country that have to deal with contaminants that we don't ever have to deal with because of the nature of where they're located and their soils.
100%.
And
it's even we'll have 4 water treatment plants here, Kevin, in the greater New Haven area. No two of those are the same, right? They're all designed and tailored to address the specific chemistry and microbiology that's coming from that particular resource. So, the treatment plant at Lake Gillard is different than the treatment plant at Lake Whitney, is different than the treatment plant at Lake Saltonstall. There are certainly, geographic differences. So the desert Southwest has, very different treatment processes than we have here in New England, because they're drawing water from 2,000-3,000 feet, below ground, whereas, we're in the quote unquote, well, you can't see me doing, air quotes, but, we're in the water-rich New England area, so we don't have to do things like that. And as a result, our treatment processes are significantly different. We have other concerns.
all right, so if you're listening at home, think about this region. We have treatment plants over in the North Branford area. They're very, they're surrounded by woods, by the watershed, right? So those water sources are very different, and what we have to treat for is very different than the Lake Whitney plant, which is in a very urban area. Lake Whitney gets a lot of runoff from the urban area, so it's that's one of the reasons we built the Lake Whitney water treatment plant, to kind of treat for those types of contaminants that we're going to find in that raw water. So as you said, within our own system, it varies greatly how we treat the water based on what we're seeing in that untreated water. Next, we got the water at a glance section. This section covers a whole bunch of different things, and we'll briefly go over some of them. Late last year, we actually had a member of Tom's team on the show, Adam Pandolfi, who kind of talked about cross connections and some common winter plumbing issues. He helped us talk about how we can winterize our homes as far as plumbing. But can you just kind of give a brief reminder of what cross connection is and why it's so important?
Sure. Yeah, cross connections think of it as a very specific niche style of plumbing inspection. So, all of our homes and businesses are connected to the water system through a service line. Let's picture a manufacturing plant. So if a manufacturing plant has a domestic water line coming from us, it comes into the facility and it may bisect. So part of that plumbing will go to traditional domestic, right? Sinks, showers, toilets, that type of thing. Another facet of that line may head toward the process floor, where it's, they're producing widgets, right? They're making something. What we want to make sure is when that water is used for process, it's no longer potable, right? They're using that water, they're blending it with other materials, it's running over other surfaces, etc. If a hydraulic condition exists in the street, a water main break, or the fire department has to use the fire hydrant because of a fire here in the neighborhood, we don't want the water that's going into that manufacturing plant down the process line to now be siphoned back out of the building as a result of a drop in pressure in the street, because that water is no longer potable. So essentially, once we send it into that manufacturing plant, we don't want it back, right? So cross connections are the guys that go in, look for those types of plumbing configurations, and essentially identify a point at which we want to put one of those siphon breaks in. It's a backflow prevention device. And that device has to be tested annually per state health department requirements, public health code requirements. And so my staff goes in, they perform that plumbing inspection. They identify where those valves need to be located. and then we return on at least an annual basis to test that device to make sure it's still functioning as intended, and make sure, again, with another inspection, whether anything else has since changed, been modified, etc., to make sure that once that water goes into that manufacturing plant, it stays there, it doesn't come back.
So this is really another way that the RWA is protecting our customers. We have a team out there inspecting these things, making sure that the water is safe to drink and there's no contamination through this unintended backflow situation.
No, it's the cross connections is a defense of the water distribution system by the utilities, and all water utilities have them. It is a regulated, statutorily mandated task here in Connecticut. We work with our regulators on this particular issue, making sure that it remains relevant, current. It takes into consideration new equipment that's coming online, the changes within the plumbing trade, as that continues to evolve and address these issues. So it's a collaborative state health department and groups of water utilities, working on to that end.
And those are certified plumbers doing those inspections, correct?
They are for the regional water authority.
Yes.
It's a requirement of that position at regional. You must be at least a P2 journeyman to come in and do that job, because essentially you're performing a plumbing inspection. So we want folks that are dedicated to the trade, and they recognize what they're looking at. We have a lot of sophisticated facilities here in Greater New Haven. We got the Yale campus and everything that goes along with it. We have power plants. We have any number of very sophisticated plumbing systems, and the inspector of those facilities needs to understand what they're looking at in order to be able to inspect it appropriately, accurately, thoroughly. And that's what my staff does.
Great. So as we go through the water at a glance section, we have an entire page on our lead reduction program in lead and copper. If you want to hear more about that, Tom and I have spent 2 hours on this show talking about that in the past. I encourage you to go back and listen to that. We will talk a little bit about lead as we go through the actual water quality tables, because I want Tom to explain how the lead testing actually works. But if you want to hear about lead reduction and the lead and copper rule, like I said, we've done 2 shows on that in the past, so go back and listen. This section also talks about some other contaminants that we test for. We're going to talk about those in the table too. And then we reach a new page that I added to the water quality report, the treatment process in 5 steps. With this page, I wanted to give a high-level view of the treatment process, what the things that we do to get water out of a reservoir into the plant, what we do in the plant and out the door. So there's 5 basic steps. There's a lot more than this, but these are like the 5 major steps. So Tom, can you talk for a minute on each one of these steps? And I may jump in too, because I used to give treatment plant tours, so I know enough to be dangerous about this stuff.
Sure. Yeah, like you say, Kevin, this is a very high level view of the backbones, if you will, of water treatment process. So the first one is coagulation, flocculation. You look at when water comes in from a reservoir, comes up out of the ground from a well, there are some very, very fine colloidal type of particulates that are too small for you to see with your eyes. But we have to remove that from the water. So this process is where we'll add I'll call it a chemical compound that you almost think of as like sticky paper, in a liquid sense. So what it does through electrochemistry is attracts those different colloidal particles so that they become larger and larger. They become then large enough for gravity to take a hold of them and then settle those out. So the coagulation is that process of coming together of those small, tiny particles to become larger particles. So now you can actually work with them. You can actually remove them. So that's the first.
So this is my favorite part of the This is where I'm going to totally geek out, because when you actually go to a treatment plant and you see this process, you can actually see the particles get bigger and bigger as it attracts the particulate, the contaminants. You actually see, it's called flock. You see the flock getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's just such a to me, it's a very cool thing to see.
Well, it is.
And it
You
gets
know,
heavier and heavier, and it starts sinking to the bottom.
yeah, you know, you can look at water when it comes in, and it may have a discoloration to it. What that color is actually those colloidal particles. You can't see the individual particles, but where you can see them en masse is what you're looking at, and this process translates that, if you will, into a larger and larger and larger mass, and it can then settle out, as Kevin mentioned, and the water becomes magically clearer, right? Because you've removed all of that background. And really the next step is really that what's happening as that flock is formed, it begins to form that sediment, and it begins to drop out. The process of gravity takes hold of it and starts to settle that out. Now, sedimentation is the more traditional mechanism where you're forming that, you're introducing the coagulant, you form that flock settles. That's sedimentation. It's a top to bottom type of thing. Some of the newer technologies, and we have this in 2 of our surface water treatment plants, is dissolved air flotation. So think of this as you're not adding that sticky paper type of chemical to form that flock to then let gravity settle it. You're actually introducing very micro, they're called microbubbles of air to the bottom of this vessel, you know, a storage vessel. And as the air comes up through the water column, it's lifting those colloidal, those really small particles to the surface. And then you're almost forming a flock-like material at the surface of the water, and then a skimmer comes across, like you're taking the cream off the top of, you know, a beverage of your choice, kind of thing. And you're removing it that way. What's beneficial here is you're not introducing a chemical, so you're not paying for a chemical to then be removed and then forming more of a residual waste stream to then get rid of. So you're kind of like paying for that twice, in a manner of speaking. Dissolved air flotation is, I think, a much more green is the right term, but it's a much friendlier, I think, environmental option. And you're still doing the job, but you're not generating as large a waste stream because you're not putting a chemical in to take a chemical out. You're using air to take a chemical out. So I think it's just it's a much friendlier option, if you will, if I could say it that way. And like I say, it works well. Filtration would be the next step. So now you've taken kind of like that, I'll say those heavier particulates out of the water. You've kind of done that cleaning, but now you're going to run it through a filter. That's going to even remove, you know, more material from the water. It acts a little bit differently. There are multimedia, so you are going to get some mechanical removal of some of these particulates that may be lingering, but it's also an opportunity if you're using a granular activated carbon or powder activated carbon, you're removing some contaminants, specifically organic contaminants, through the process of adsorption. So you're moving different types of chemistry in a slightly different way in the same vessel, in that same process step. Once water removed goes through the filters, is collected, it goes through a disinfection step. We use sodium hypochlorite. It's similar but not the same as a bleach. It's in a much less concentrated form. Once disinfection has been completed, we then also add call it a conditioning agent for corrosion control. And that's to make sure that the water is not, I'll say, corrosive or aggressive to any of the surfaces it's going to come in contact with. And by surfaces, I'm talking here primarily of metallic surfaces. So whether it's the iron water mains in the street, the copper plumbing in your house, you know, the water itself is not going to be aggressive and reactive with those surfaces as a result of the conditioning that we add as part of the corrosion control step.
And again, Tom and I spent considerable time talking about corrosion control on our last 2 shows. So again, go back and listen to those shows if you want to know more about corrosion control. All right, so now we're going to actually turn to the tables. The next page is a list of terminology and abbreviations, and I've singled out three that I'd like to just review before we jump into the table. MCL, can you talk about what an MCL is?
Sure, maximum contaminant level. That's for those tests or those contaminants that are regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. They've identified what the maximum contaminant level should be. So anything over that concentration would be above the MCL. It would not be permitted. That's our line in the sand from a regulatory perspective. We have to make sure that if we have any contaminant of whatever it may be, it's going to be below that MCL value. The MCL value, some people will suggest, oh, the MCL should be 0. That's not realistic. Trying to get to 0 affordably is difficult, very, very expensive, and it may be beyond the technology available today. So that's in a nutshell, that's an MCL.
That's an MCL, and then the MCLG. In my career, this one confuses a lot of people.
Yeah, and understandably. So, when you look at the MCL, that's based on health effects data. So if you're talking about, I'll say contaminant A, and the Environmental Protection Agency and its academic partners may have identified an MCL of, say, 5 parts per billion, arbitrarily. And so as a water utility, as long as you stay under that 5 parts per billion, you're considered to be compliant with the regulation. However, maybe 5 is the MCL, but the MCLG may be 1. That's a goal. It's the maximum contaminant level goal. G stands for goal. And I think that's what you're always striving for. And as utilities, that's what you're always striving for. But this is where the technology starts to come into play, where, lead has an MCLG of 0. Lead has an MCL of 15 parts per billion. 15 parts per billion, not to confuse the issue, but that's not based in a human health effect data determination. That's more of a treatment technique value. So it might have been a poor example to give. But my point is, there's no safe concentration of lead, right? So the MCLG is 0, and that's what we're always striving to get. The difficulty is in the technology to be able to condition the water to the point where it becomes so non-reactive that it's not going to solicit some lead concentration if the two shall meet,
Yeah. So the MCLG is more aspirational,
and it is, because so many things. Once the water leaves our facilities, it may be used in such a way that we have no control over. So we try to condition the water to the point where it's going to be relatively non-reactive if it comes into contact. But that may be beyond our ability to do.
And you've mentioned a couple times now parts per billion. So I wanted to just review quickly the parts per section of this. You got parts per million, parts per billion, parts per trillion. Those are the degrees to which we measure things, and they're regulated. And Tom and I were talking before the show. Parts per trillion, I actually used I looked it up online to find a good way to explain parts per trillion. So think about parts per trillion as 1 drop of water per trillion drops of water. So 1 part per trillion would be 1 drop in a trillion drops. I know what you're asking out there. What's a trillion drops of water look like? Well, according to Google, 20,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools is 1 trillion drops of water. So when we're talking about testing things at parts per trillion, our sophisticated equipment, our labs are looking for 1 drop of something in 20,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of water. So, parts per million, parts per billion, the same things. It's 1 drop per million drops or 1 part per billion drops. Did I do a good job explaining that?
You did. It's tough to it's tough to wrap your head around. What does all of that mean? It's like you said, very sophisticated analytical equipment. And you think about too, Kevin, in drinking water, it's, what is it, 2 or 3% of the water we produce is actually used for consumptive purposes. So, but all of the water we produce has to meet those standards. So that's a lift.
Yeah, and sometimes they have to invent new equipment to test for these minuscule amounts, right? And we'll talk about that with PFAS. I won't go into that now, but that's a good discussion for PFAS. All right, after 40 minutes or so, we're finally going to start talking about the tables.
Fantastic.
I'm not going to go through all of these. I just picked out some that I think are interesting to talk about. First one is THMs and THAs, the trihalomethanes and heliocitic acid. Can you talk about those two, what they are, why we test for them, and where they come from?
Yeah, those are the two major families of disinfection byproducts. So disinfection byproducts are the as the name suggests, the byproducts of the interaction between disinfectants, and in our case, again, it's hypochlorite, it's sodium hypochlorite, chlorine, and naturally occurring organics. It can take any number of forms, but it's naturally, we call it NOM.
Like leaves.
Yeah, like decayed leaves and anything organic that's kind of in a state of decomposition, right? So it's natural organics. So when natural organics come into contact with disinfectants, you form these disinfection byproducts. THMs, HAAs are the two major families. Each of those is regulated independently based on a sum total value. Of THMs, there's 4 individual compounds. HAAs, there's 5 individual compounds currently. And under regulation, we have 12 sampling locations on our distribution system. Those 12 sampling locations are defined by water age calculations because when you're forming these disinfection byproducts, that interaction continues over time until one of those two variables, the chlorine or the NOM, is exhausted. So you can picture the older, again, air quotes, right? The older the water, the higher possible values you may have for these disinfection byproducts. They are regulated.
And I will say, I may have buried the lead a little bit, but folks who read the report will see we had no exceedances for anything that we test for. So with these THMs and HAAs, you'll see we were well below the MCL on this one.
Yeah, so the importance for us here, Kevin, is when you're going through treatment, we try to remove as much of that NOM as we can. We use different oxidants in our treatment process to remove those NOM compounds. And then when you get out into the water distribution system where the water is circulating and it goes through storage and it circulates, etc., the utility has to be very well aware of how to manage its water distribution system because you want to minimize those water age values. And the way to do that is to keep water moving.
So that's THMs. Next, the one I want to talk about is lead. So again, we've done 2 hours on lead before, but I thought this would be a good place to just kind of talk about the testing protocol for lead, because it's a little bit different than some of these others in that, like I said, Tom has a team of people out taking samples. They're going into publicly available spaces, libraries, municipal buildings, McDonald's to take water samples. But the lead samples are a little bit different, right? We can't just go to a McDonald's or a library and take a sample for lead, right?
No, because really what you're doing here is we've well documented over decades. There is no lead in our source water. There's no lead in the water that we're producing out of a water treatment plant. So if people are going to be exposed by lead, it's typically as a result of the presence of lead in the form of solder, in the form of lead plumbing, as a constituent in brass within their own homes. So what you'll need to do is you don't want to necessarily go to a firehouse or a library and just open the faucet and take a sample of water, because that water may be coming in off the street and it's not really representative of the environment within which you can find lead. So lead typically is collected as a first draw sample after water has been idle in plumbing for a minimum of 6 hours, so typically during an overnight. and you'll take a first draw sample to assess, that water quality, to see if in fact maybe there's something in the plumbing of that house or business where it may be exposing folks to lead just through the plumbing that's there. Some more recent sampling methods around the lead and copper rule improvements are requiring us to collect timed samples, if you will. So we'll be taking samples not only of first draw, but we'll take samples, that are referred to as fifth liter samples. So we'll take a consecutive set of synchronous 5 1 liter bottles from a faucet of your choice, right? Could be somebody's home, could be a business. And what we're doing there is looking for the possibility of lead that exists along lengths of that service line. So it could be the faucet in the kitchen. It could be the length of plumbing that's underlying the front lawn. We're looking at different, scientific term is aliquots, but you're looking at different areas along that service line for the possibility that lead may exist from a plumbing, I'll call it an allowance for many, many years ago. Lead plumbing was not unusual, 100 years ago, 120 years ago. So while we have not installed lead in many, many years, 100 years, 80 years in this area, we do see it in historic homes, older plumbing, because again, back in the day, it was acceptable. So we have to be mindful of that.
And those are the ones we're trying to test, right?
Those are the ones that we're looking at under these regulations. It's, we have our responsibilities as water purveyors to make sure that the water is safe to consume. Under this regulation, specifically, we have to look at situations on what's referred to as private side plumbing that may influence the quality of water within people's own homes. And under that initiatives, we're asking people to go into the basement. We're asking them maybe to take photographs of their service lines, upload that to us from our website so that we can document the types of service lines people may have serving their own homes. We're putting together an inventory as required under the regulation. We'll identify certain services that are eligible for replacement. We're securing money through the federal allowances to do that. It's a very, and again, we've talked about this over a couple of hours. It's a very detailed regulation, but it's going to serve a lot of good. We're all interested in removing lead from the environment, whether it's in the form of lead paint, lead and gas back in the day, dating myself here a little bit, but also, lead in plumbing, just to try to get rid of that and limit exposure, because as a neurotoxin, it is a significant challenge.
And the results of that test really also validate that our corrosion control program actually works.
That's right.
Because if you're testing a house that has lead plumbing, you're not finding lead in the system. That means your corrosion control is working. So,
yeah, and I mean our results are consistently, we're not finding any lead anywhere.
Right. So the next one I wanted to hit is chlorine. Why are we testing for chlorine?
We want to make sure that we have chlorine as a disinfectant. It serves a purpose.
So that's something that's actually supposed to be in the water.
It's actually something.
Yes.
It's the disinfection of choice. There are a number that we can be choosing through. There's chloramines and chlorine dioxide.
So chlorine is kind of like an umbrella term for disinfectant, primary disinfectant.
Right. But as a utility who's obligated to disinfect water, you also want to make sure that disinfectant is persistent. Hey, look, nobody wants their water to be overly chlorinated, because then it's like walking into the YMCA pool or something, and not to disparage the YMCA, but you know what I'm saying.
Oh, absolutely.
You don't want to deal with that, but you don't also want your water that's supposed to be disinfected to make sure that it's, from a microbiological point of view, safe to drink. You don't want it to be absent either. So we have to test for chlorine to make sure that we do have a measurable residual in the water that we're distributing. Again, that's a regulatory requirement. In fact, that regulatory requirement we fully expect will be bolstered here in the next couple of years with some revisions around the disinfection byproduct rule. That's another topic for another day.
Yeah, and I always like to say, I tell people, picture like our water system, and you live in the last house in our water system, you want to know that you have chlorine in the water at the last house, the furthest house from that treatment plant. You still got to have chlorine in that water, and that's what we're making sure, that there's that residual of chlorine in the water
And
at the furthest ends of the system.
that's our obligation. I mean, that's our
Absolutely.
obligation under the regulation. I know a lot of people, including myself, that don't necessarily like the taste of chlorine or the smell of chlorine. Some people are sensitive to it in a shower environment, as an example. But you have the opportunity. You can remove that chlorine if you so choose, but it is our obligation to bring it to you to make sure that the water is safe to consume from a microbiological perspective.
Next term that most people probably don't know, turbidity. Can you explain what turbidity is?
Yeah, simply it's a measurement of clarity.
Clarity.
Using light refraction. So you think of things of turbid, right? They're cloudy, right? Turbidity is just a clarity measurement using light.
And that's another one where we have to meet a standard for turbidity.
Yeah, turbidity standards are strict, and in fact, when you go into a water treatment plant, you have to measure your turbidity coming in. Individual filter beds have individual turbidity requirements. If you tie those filter beds together in what's referred to as a combined filter effluent, that has a turbidity value that has to be met. The water that leaves the treatment plant has a turbidity value that has to be met. And finally, the distribution system has a turbidity value that has to be met. So turbidity is a very common assessment tool for the success of water treatment.
So I wanted to talk, so there's this whole next section, it's statewide levels of unregulated contaminants. Mm-hmm. If they're unregulated, why are we testing for them?
When you look at unregulated contaminants, let's go back to the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. So that is a list that comes out from the EPA roughly every 5 years. EPA and its academic partners come up with a wished list of about 150 different constituents of water, right? Could be chemical, could be microbiological, etc. From that 150, they pare it down to about 30. So every 5th year, the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, the UCMR, comes out. The latest iteration was number 5. And really what that is a data gathering tool by EPA to get a better idea of scope and concentration of contaminants of concern. So most recently in UCMR 5, 30 compounds, 29 of those were PFAS compounds. So EPA is trying to determine whether those 29 are everywhere in the United States, coast to coast. Do they tend to be more regional? Are they, in certain areas rather than others? And what concentrations are utilities actually seeing those contaminants? So it's and I also, a 30th compound was the metal lithium.
Lithium, yeah. So the non-PFAS ones that are in the unregulated contaminants, those are all contaminants that were in prior UCMRs.
For the most part.
And that's why we're putting them in there.
Yeah, it's a data gathering for the scientists to determine what should be regulated. Where is the priority based on, different data that they're collecting geographically, et cetera.
And I think you've done this before because it really was a good segue into the last thing that I want to hit with the few minutes we have left, which is PFAS. Or, you hear people read about it, they hear about it. We're testing for it. Can you talk a little bit about the results that we saw last year in 2024 in our system?
Sure. Yeah, we've been looking at PFAS. Really, it was part of the UCMR 3 back in 2014. We've been looking at it since then, really since 2019, very regularly. Our laboratory is licensed with the Connecticut Department of Public Health for 18 compounds currently. We expect to add an additional 11 compounds to our certification list over the course of the summer. Not to tell stories out of school, but I think the regional water authorities consumers have spent almost $1 million on analytical equipment for our laboratory to test PFAS and other organic constituents, but PFAS has been the driver.
And this is one that's a part per trillion.
This is parts per trillion.
And the proposed limit is 4 parts per trillion.
4 parts per trillion is the proposed limit for 2 specific compounds. 3 compounds have a proposed limit of 10 parts per trillion. And then the sixth compound does not have its own limit, but it's part of a bundling of
Yeah, we could do
its
a whole
peers.
show on that.
Yeah, please.
We won't.
We won't.
We don't want
Not
people to
today.
fall asleep.
Yeah. But yeah, so our PFAS results have been very good. I mean, honestly, so when we look at those 11 points of treatment, we look at those every 90 days. I will say 10 of those are in great shape. You know, we're really not seeing anything. And if we see anything, it is, you know, we talked about maybe the limit being 4. We're seeing 1s and 2s if we see that. And that's for maybe if we're doing a scan of 18 different compounds, we're seeing that in 5 or 6 compounds. The majority, 12 compounds or so, we're not even seeing. We're testing for them anyway because it's the right thing to do. There's really only one resource right now where we feel we're going to need to put some treatment on that just because of some legacy issues from decades gone by. We think it's just part of the environment in this particular area from activities from many decades ago that they're still persistent. We've done a lot of work on what we need to be doing. We're already pilot testing those treatment options.
Right. And I would say
we're in pretty good shape in terms of how to approach.
And this is the only thing actually that if you go on our website, you can see the testing data as we receive it, because we're actually posting our results as we receive them. Some of them are quarterly, some of them are twice a year, but as we're getting the results and analyzing the results, we're actually putting those up on our website under the water quality section.
Yeah, and we're doing it in such a way too, we're mimicking the cadence of the regulation, what the regulation is going to look like. So at least when our customers are looking at data, they can look at it in such a way that it's making sense from how it's being regulated.
Right.
Otherwise, these are just numbers and parts per trillion, and your head starts to spin.
So we only have like 2 minutes left, and luckily Tom has already done the 5 unrelated questions. So if you want to hear whether he likes cookies, brownies, or ice cream, go back and listen to the last show. Tom, thank you for coming on. I think our listeners really got a good idea of what this report is, what it isn't, and be on the lookout for that postcard. You can go on our website right now under water quality and see the report. You don't have to wait for the postcard. One thing I do want our listeners to take away from this conversation is we have a large team at the RWA protecting water quality, analyzing water quality, making sure that the water that we send to our customers is top notch, and it's proven by the report, right? So it's all in the report here. It proves that the water that we're sending to our customers is the best quality possible. We're proud to do it. We love to do it. And please read the report, because it actually takes a long time to put together, and we spend a lot of time on it. So please read the report. You've been listening to Liquid Lunch with the Regional Water Authority. Today we learned all about the 2024 Water Quality Report from the RWA. If you missed any portion of the show, listen to us as a podcast. Look up New Haven Independent Liquid Lunch. You can go on the YouTube channel, New Haven Independent Liquid Lunch. Listen to any part of the show. So thank you for joining us, and until next time, stay hydrated, New Haven.